Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that lives in your medicine cabinet, your bloodstream, your gym bag, and the unspoken confessions of roughly half the professional athletes you've ever admired. Tonight we're talking about steroids. Not the scary sounding word your doctor mutters when he prescribes you a 5-day course for a sinus infection. I mean all of them, from the testosterone your own body already makes, to the injectable compounds with names that sound like rejected Transformer characters. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Tonight's topic came straight from one of you, and I genuinely mean it when I say these suggestions are what keep this channel alive and weird and worth making. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always 3 in the morning somewhere, and I respect that deeply. You can also find us on Spotify now, links in the description, go check it out. Dim the lights, turn on a fan and get horizontal. Now, have you ever wondered why your body makes testosterone in the first place, and whether it's secretly doing a bad job? Have you ever looked at a bodybuilder at the gym and thought, is that chemistry or just commitment? Did pharmaceutical companies once sell steroids as the cure for basically everything, and were they right? Can you actually go bald from a synthetic hormone that was invented in a lab in 1935 by a man who won a Nobel Prize? How did something doctors prescribe for arthritis end up being banned from the Olympics? And is it possible, just theoretically, that your grandma's anti-inflammatory cream and Ben Johnson's world record shattering sprint have more in common than anyone wants to admit? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up inside the endocrine system. The year is any year from 1935 to the present. Your hormones are talking, your receptors are listening, and somewhere, a man in a tracksuit is injecting something he will later describe in a press conference as nutritional supplement. Welcome. Let's start at the beginning, which is a chemistry classroom nobody asked to be in. A steroid, at its most honest, is a class of organic compounds built around a specific arrangement of 4 carbon rings, a molecular skeleton so ancient and so fundamental that your body has been assembling variations of it since before you were born. Cholesterol is a steroid. So is cortisol. So is the testosterone in your bloodstream right now, doing its quiet, largely unacknowledged work while you lie there, convinced you understand what the word steroid means. The problem with the word steroid is that it has been colonized by associations, by bodybuilders and banned athletes and congressional hearings, and that one guy at your gym who got noticeably larger over a single winter and started wearing sleeveless shirts in November. Those associations are not wrong exactly, but they are incomplete in the way that describing water as the stuff in swimming pools is technically accurate but missing something. The molecule itself has no agenda. It doesn't know it's controversial. It's just 4 rings of carbon atoms arranged in a specific interlocking pattern, with various chemical groups hanging off the sides depending on which steroid you're looking at, and what it's been designed by either evolution or a pharmaceutical chemist to do. Here is a short list of things your body makes right now that are technically steroids: testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, aldosterone, vitamin D, and bile acids, which are the compounds your digestive system uses to break down fat. You are, in a very literal biochemical sense, a steroid-producing organism. You have been since conception. You will be until you stop being anything at all. The question has never really been whether steroids are present in your body. The question is which ones, in what amounts, doing what job, and whether someone has introduced a synthetic version from outside that your receptors are now responding to without entirely knowing the difference. When people say steroids in the context of sport or bodybuilding or the news, they almost always mean anabolic-androgenic steroids, synthetic compounds modelled on testosterone that increase muscle protein synthesis, accelerate recovery and enhance physical performance. When people say steroids in the context of medicine, they almost always mean corticosteroids. synthetic compounds modelled on cortisol that suppress inflammation and calm overactive immune responses. These two categories are related in the way that a Labrador and a wolf are related. Same broad family, completely different temperament, and you would not treat them the same way in your living room. The confusion between these two categories has done real damage. It has caused people to refuse prescribed anti-inflammatory medication because they didn't want to take steroids. It has caused other people to dramatically underestimate the physiological impact of the compounds they were taking because they associated the word with something their doctor prescribed for poison ivy. Language shapes perception, and in this particular case language has been doing a sloppy, imprecise job for decades, while the actual chemistry sat quietly in the corner, untroubled and unchanged. So here is your foundation, your clearing of the fog before the rest of this gets complicated. A steroid is a chemical structure. That structure can be used by your adrenal glands to manage your stress response, by your reproductive organs to regulate fertility, by pharmaceutical scientists to reduce inflammation in a damaged knee, or by an athlete who would like to be stronger and faster than biology, was planning to make them on the agreed-upon timeline. Same 4 rings. Wildly different consequences. The molecule doesn't make the moral call. That part, historically speaking, has been left to humans, with results that range from Nobel Prizes to congressional hearings to a very awkward press conference in Seoul in 1988. We'll get to all of it. But this, right here, is where it starts. Before there were labs and syringes and very suspicious track and field results, there was just testosterone, a hormone your body manufactures in the testes, the ovaries, and the adrenal glands, depending on who you are and what equipment you showed up with. Scientists had long suspected something chemical was responsible for the qualities associated with maleness: muscle, aggression, hair in unexpected places, and the unshakable confidence of a man who has never once doubted his parallel parking. But isolating that something took until 1935, when a team of researchers managed to extract testosterone in crystalline form and stare at it under a microscope with the quiet pride of people who have just changed everything. The path to that extraction was not a clean or comfortable one. In the 1800s, a French physiologist named Charles-Édouard Brown-Séquard injected himself with extract made from the testicles of dogs and guinea pigs, and reported, with tremendous enthusiasm, that he felt rejuvenated, stronger, and mentally sharper. He was 72 years old. He published his findings. The medical establishment responded with a mixture of fascination and politely restrained horror. Brown-Séquard was not, it turned out, experiencing the effects of testosterone. His extracts almost certainly contained negligible active hormone, but he was experiencing something, possibly the world's most scientifically documented placebo effect, and possibly the first recorded case of a man trying to solve aging with an injection, and refusing to admit it hadn't quite worked as advertised. He is, in retrospect, ahead of his time in ways both useful and cautionary. The actual isolation of testosterone came from 3 competing research groups working more or less simultaneously in the 1930s. Ernst Lacour, working in Amsterdam, extracted it from bull testicles, an enormous quantity of bull testicles as it happens, since the yield from biological tissue was vanishingly small. Leopold Ruzicka and Adolf Butenandt, working in Switzerland and Germany respectively, synthesized it chemically, which was the development that mattered most, because synthesis meant production at scale, and production at scale meant medicine, and medicine meant money, and money meant that everyone suddenly became very interested in testosterone in a way that pure scientific curiosity had not previously managed to generate. What testosterone does in the body is more complicated than its popular reputation suggests. Yes, it promotes muscle protein synthesis, the process by which your cells build new muscle fiber. Yes, it deepens the voice during puberty, drives the development of secondary sexual characteristics and influences libido. It also plays significant roles in bone density, red blood cell production, cognitive function, mood regulation, and the maintenance of lean body mass throughout adulthood. In women, it exists in smaller amounts, but is equally important for bone health, energy, and sexual function, a fact that tends to get omitted from the cultural conversation, which prefers its testosterone story simple and male. When testosterone levels are genuinely low, whether due to a medical condition, aging, or some other cause, the effects are real and measurable: fatigue, loss of muscle mass, reduced bone density, depression, and impaired sexual function. This is what replacement therapy was originally designed to address. This is the medical story. The performance enhancement story begins at the point where someone looked at the genuine benefits of replacing deficient testosterone and asked a question that sounded reasonable in the moment. If replacing low testosterone helps people feel normal, what would supraphysiological amounts do to someone who is already normal? The answer to that question has occupied an enormous amount of human energy, regulatory attention, and laboratory time for the past 90 years. We are still, in various ways, working through it. In 1939, two chemists, Adolf Butenandt and Leopold Ruzicka, were awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, in part for their work synthesizing sex hormones, including testosterone. This is the moment steroids went from laboratory curiosity to institutional legitimacy, from fringe experiment to endorsed science, from the kind of thing you'd do in a back room to the kind of thing you'd accept a prize for in Stockholm while wearing a formal suit. It is, historically speaking, the last time anyone involved in steroids would have this much dignity in a public setting. Butenandt's path to the prize had been methodical and somewhat extraordinary. Working in Germany throughout the 1920s and 30s, he had isolated estrone, one of the estrogen hormones, Diesel, from pregnant women's urine, working with quantities that required processing thousands of litres of urine to obtain a few milligrams of compound, which is either a testament to scientific dedication or a very effective argument for better funding. He later isolated androsterone, a weaker androgen related to testosterone, and eventually synthesized progesterone. His work was a systematic attempt to chemically map the territory of human sex hormones, conducted with the careful rigour of someone who understood that the molecules he was identifying were going to matter enormously. Ruzicka, working in Switzerland, brought a chemist's practical instinct to the problem. Where Butenandt was methodical, Ruzicka was entrepreneurial. He understood that the path from biological isolation to widespread application ran through chemical synthesis, and he pursued that path with the urgency of someone who could see the commercial and medical implications clearly. His synthesis of testosterone from cholesterol, demonstrating that the body's own steroid precursor could be chemically converted to its most famous product, was an elegant piece of work that pointed directly toward the pharmaceutical industry's next several decades of development. There is a detail about the Nobel Prize in Chemistry that year that tends to get omitted in the triumphant version of the story. Butenandt was initially unable to accept the prize. He had been forbidden from doing so by the Nazi government of Germany, which had issued a decree following its fury at Karl von Ossietzky, a German pacifist, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize 3 years earlier. Butenandt accepted the prize certificate after the war ended. Ruzicka accepted his. The chemistry was real, the recognition deserved, and the circumstances surrounding it, a reminder that science does not exist in a sealed room, removed from the political and historical conditions in which it's conducted. What the Nobel Prize did for steroid science was legitimize it at the highest institutional level. The prize sent a message to pharmaceutical companies, governments, and the broader medical establishment that the chemistry of sex hormones was serious, important, and worthy of sustained investment. The 1940s would bring that investment in abundance, along with the first stirrings of applications that the Nobel Committee had not specifically anticipated when they handed out the certificates. The distance from a prize for synthesizing testosterone in a laboratory to an American physician injecting it into weightlifters in the 1950s is, in historical terms, surprisingly short. About 20 years, a world war, and the particular human tendency to look at a powerful compound and immediately start thinking about what else it might do. By the early 1940s, synthetic testosterone was being studied with the breathless enthusiasm of people who have discovered something they believe will fix absolutely everything. The list of conditions researchers hoped testosterone might treat reads like a fever dream written by someone who had access to one hormone and unlimited confidence. Depression, fatigue, impotence, aging, wound healing and rest. This one is real. The psychological devastation of being a prisoner of war. Military researchers, particularly in the United States, briefly explored whether testosterone supplementation could help soldiers recover faster, fight harder, and endure more. The answer was complicated. The enthusiasm was not. The broader medical optimism about testosterone in this period was genuine and not entirely misplaced. Physicians were seeing real results in patients with hypergonadism, men whose testes produced inadequate testosterone due to disease, injury, or developmental conditions, and the improvements in these patients' strength, mood, and overall function were striking enough to generate the natural but not always evidence-supported conclusion that if replacing a deficiency produces this much benefit, then giving extra to someone already sufficient must produce even more. This is a logical error that has been made repeatedly in the history of pharmacology, and it continues to be made. But in the 1940s it had the additional defense of being a relatively new idea, made by people who genuinely didn't yet know where it led. Not all the research from this period was conducted with equivalent rigor or ethics. Several studies on testosterone's effects were conducted on institutionalized populations, men in mental hospitals, prisoners, and other individuals whose consent was either inadequately obtained or not obtained at all. This was not unusual for the era. The norms of research ethics that now govern clinical trials were still decades away from their formal codification. But it means that some of the early data on testosterone's behavioral and physical effects came from studies that would not be approved today, a complication that sits quietly in the literature for anyone who goes looking. The wartime interest in performance-enhancing compounds was not limited to the Allied powers. German military researchers investigated the use of testosterone and other steroids to increase aggression, strength, and endurance in soldiers, though the evidence for how extensively these experiments were conducted and how formally they were integrated into military medicine is incomplete and contested by historians. What is clear is that the question of using hormonal chemistry to enhance human performance under combat conditions was being asked on multiple sides of the war simultaneously, which tells you something about the universal appeal of the idea and something about how quickly powerful new compounds attract the attention of institutions whose primary interest is in what those compounds can be made to do. After the war, the testosterone research that had been conducted in emergency conditions was folded back into mainstream medicine, where it generated a set of prescription practices that were broad, enthusiastic, and in retrospect somewhat indiscriminate. Testosterone was prescribed for male aging, for depression, for fatigue, for what the 1940s and 50s would sometimes describe as male climacteric, a concept analogous to menopause, referring to the gradual hormonal and physical changes of aging men, and for an assortment of other conditions where its actual efficacy was either modest or unmeasured. It was, in the parlance of every era that has discovered a powerful new compound, something of a wonder drug. Wonder drug phases tend to be followed by complications phases, which tend to be followed by regulation phases. You can probably see where this particular sequence is heading. In 1948, a rheumatologist at the Mayo Clinic named Philip Hench injected a patient suffering from severe rheumatoid arthritis with cortisone, a corticosteroid synthesized from the adrenal gland, and watched her get out of a wheelchair and walk down the street. He stood there in stunned silence, which is the appropriate response to witnessing something that looks like a miracle but is actually chemistry. The following year, Hench shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Corticosteroids, the class that includes cortisone, prednisone, and the stuff your doctor prescribes when your immune system has decided to treat your own joints like a foreign enemy, had just entered medicine's main stage, trailing clouds of glory and almost no awareness of what the long-term side effects would turn out to be. Cortisol is your body's primary stress hormone, produced by the adrenal glands in response to physiological and psychological stressors. Its job is broadly anti-inflammatory. It modulates the immune response, reduces swelling, and manages the body's reaction to injury and infection. Under normal circumstances, this is a beautifully calibrated system. You encounter a stressor, cortisol rises, inflammation is managed, and the situation resolves. The problem arises when that system is dysregulated, when chronic stress keeps cortisol chronically elevated, or when an autoimmune condition produces inflammation so severe and sustained that the body's own regulatory mechanisms cannot contain it. In those cases, giving the body a synthetic version of its own anti-inflammatory hormone in doses large enough to overwhelm the runaway immune response can produce results that look, from the outside, exactly like a miracle. For patients with rheumatoid arthritis in 1948, cortisone was precisely that. Rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disease in which the immune system attacks the synovial membrane lining the joints, producing pain, swelling, and progressive destruction of the joint itself. In severe cases, it is profoundly disabling. The treatments available before cortisone were largely palliative: aspirin, rest, gold salts administered by injection with limited and inconsistent effect. Cortisone did not cure rheumatoid arthritis. It doesn't cure it today. But it controlled the inflammation with a speed and effectiveness that had simply no precedent in the prior treatment landscape. Watching a patient who had been confined to a wheelchair stand and walk was not a small thing. It was the kind of clinical observation that changes a field. The years immediately following the cortisone announcement saw a wave of research into corticosteroids that was both productive and, in some respects, insufficiently cautious. New synthetic derivatives were developed: prednisone, prednisolone, dexamethasone, hydrocortisone, each with slightly different potency and duration profiles, each generating its own pattern of clinical use. The conditions for which corticosteroids were prescribed expanded rapidly: asthma, inflammatory bowel disease, skin conditions, allergic reactions, organ transplant rejection, certain cancers. Some of these applications were and remain entirely evidence-based and clinically appropriate. Others, in the initial enthusiasm of the discovery phase, were broader than the evidence warranted. The complications became apparent over time, as complications do. Long-term corticosteroid use produces a constellation of effects that the 1948 press coverage had not anticipated: bone density loss leading to osteoporosis, increased susceptibility to infection from immune suppression, elevated blood sugar, fluid retention, weight gain particularly around the face and trunk, cataracts, skin thinning, and adrenal suppression, meaning that the adrenal glands, accustomed to having their job done by an external hormone, reduce their own production, creating a dependency that must be tapered carefully when the drug is discontinued. These are real costs, and medicine has spent the subsequent decades learning to weigh them against the genuine benefits, using the lowest effective dose for the shortest effective period, a principle that sounds straightforward and is somewhat harder to apply in practice. The miracle had fine print. Most miracles, it turns out, do. Somewhere in a drawer in your parents' house or your own bathroom cabinet, there is almost certainly a small orange pill bottle containing a few leftover prednisone tablets, sitting next to a bottle of ibuprofen and a thermometer with a dead battery. Prednisone is a corticosteroid, a synthetic version of cortisol, and it is prescribed for an almost absurdly broad range of conditions: asthma, allergies, autoimmune disorders, skin rashes, inflammatory bowel disease, certain cancers, organ transplant rejection, and the kind of poison ivy exposure that makes a grown adult weep openly in a pharmacy. It was approved in the United States in 1955 and has been quietly everywhere ever since, doing useful work and causing side effects that doctors describe with the careful tone of someone reading a very long list. Prednisone is what pharmacologists call a prodrug. It is not active in the form you swallow. Your liver converts it to prednisolone, which is the active compound, a distinction that matters primarily for people with liver disease and for trivia nights, but which is worth knowing because it explains why prednisolone is prescribed directly in some situations where prednisone is not ideal. The conversion is efficient in most people, the effect is rapid, and the relief, in conditions where the immune system is doing something it should not be doing, can be remarkable. A patient with a severe asthma attack who receives prednisone in an emergency department can be breathing normally within hours. A person in the middle of a severe allergic reaction, face swollen and airways narrowing, stabilizes. The drug works with a directness that earns it a permanent place in emergency medicine, outpatient clinics, and the aforementioned bathroom cabinet. The short course prescription, 5 to 10 days, taken to address a flare of inflammation or an acute allergic response, is what most people's experience with prednisone looks like. You take the pills, you feel better, you finish the course, you move on. The side effects at this duration and dose are generally manageable. Increased appetite, some difficulty sleeping, a mild buzz of energy that can feel pleasant or unsettling depending on your disposition, and occasionally a mood shift that your family may notice before you do. These effects resolve when the course ends. They are, in the context of treating a condition that was causing you significant suffering, a reasonable trade. The longer-term prescription is a different calculation. For people with chronic autoimmune conditions, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, vasculitis, prednisone may be required for months or years to control the underlying disease. At these timescales, the side effect profile expands considerably. The bone density loss that accumulates with chronic corticosteroid use is one of the leading causes of secondary osteoporosis, meaning osteoporosis that occurs as a consequence of medical treatment rather than aging alone. Physicians managing patients on long-term prednisone prescribe calcium, vitamin D, and often bisphosphonates, a class of drugs that reduce bone loss, as a matter of routine, not because these patients have bone disease, but because the treatment for their actual disease is quietly causing one. There is a particular experience that many people on chronic prednisone describe that doesn't appear prominently in the package insert: the feeling of being trapped between the side effects of the drug and the consequences of stopping it. Prednisone controls the disease. The disease without prednisone is sometimes incapacitating. But prednisone over time produces its own damage. Navigating that trap is the daily reality of millions of people with chronic inflammatory conditions, managed in partnership with physicians who are also navigating it, doing the ongoing arithmetic of benefit versus harm that doesn't resolve into a clean answer. It is, in the end, a drug that saves quality of life and costs quality of life in different proportions for different people, which is a more complicated sentence than any bathroom cabinet suggests. The 1952 Olympics in Helsinki, Finland, is where the modern story of performance-enhancing steroids quietly begins, not with a dramatic announcement or a failed drug test, but with a Soviet weightlifting team that showed up inexplicably enormous and proceeded to dominate the competition in ways that made their American counterparts uncomfortable and curious in equal measure. The Soviets had been experimenting with testosterone injections on their athletes, a detail that American team physician John Ziegler would later confirm after a conversation with a Soviet doctor at a social event, conducted with the candour of two men who had both had enough vodka to be honest about what their governments were doing. The Soviet sports program in the early 1950s was not operating the way most Western observers assumed sports programs operated. It was a state enterprise, fully funded, centrally coordinated and oriented explicitly toward the production of international athletic success as a demonstration of socialist superiority. Athletes were professionals in everything but name, supported by the state with training facilities, coaching, scientific support and, as Helsinki made clear, pharmaceutical assistance. The system was designed to win. Winning was political. The resources allocated to winning were correspondingly serious. When testosterone was identified as a compound that could increase muscle mass and strength, the question of whether to use it was apparently resolved quite quickly. John Ziegler, the American physician at the center of the subsequent domestic response, was an interesting figure, a military veteran, a physician with a genuine scientific curiosity, and a man who appears in retrospect to have been torn between his recognition that what he was doing was probably not medicine in any traditional sense, and his conviction that American athletes deserved to compete on equal terms. After Helsinki and the subsequent World Weightlifting Championships where the pattern continued, Ziegler began experimenting with testosterone himself and on a small number of weightlifters associated with the York Barbell Club in Pennsylvania. He found the results significant, but the side effects concerning, particularly the prostate enlargement he observed in users, and this concern led him toward a collaboration that would prove consequential. The Ciba Pharmaceutical Company presented with Ziegler's feedback about what he was looking for: anabolic effects, muscle building, strength enhancement, with fewer androgenic effects than straight testosterone, developed methandrostenolone, sold as Dianabol, which Ziegler then tested on the York Barbell athletes. The results were, by the standards of what people had seen before, remarkable. Strength increased, muscle mass increased, recovery improved, the athletes were better. Ziegler himself would later express regret about his role in introducing the compound more widely, citing his observation that users escalated doses far beyond what he had recommended and experienced consequences he had not intended. He described himself in later interviews as having opened a door he wished he could close. The door, at that point, had been open for roughly a decade. It was not going to close. John Ziegler came home from Helsinki with a mission, which was to ensure American weightlifters could compete with the Soviet bloc, and he accomplished this mission by collaborating with the pharmaceutical company Ciba to develop a drug called methandrostenolone, marketed under the trade name Dianabol. It was approved by the FDA in 1958 for medical use. Osteoporosis, burns, tissue wasting conditions, and almost immediately began showing up in gyms with a frequency that suggested the osteoporosis epidemic was particularly concentrated among large men who spent their evenings in weight rooms. Dianabol was, by the standards of anabolic steroids, easy to take. It was oral, a small pink tablet taken daily, requiring no injection, no needle, no particular medical infrastructure. It was fast-acting, producing noticeable strength and mass gains within weeks, and it was, by the standards of what came later, relatively affordable. These qualities combined to produce a compound that spread through competitive athletics and recreational bodybuilding simultaneously, each population feeding the market and the culture around it, in ways that blurred the distinction between the athlete trying to win and the individual simply trying to look a certain way. By the early 1960s, Dianabol was the most widely used anabolic steroid in American sport and arguably in the world, and the bodybuilding culture that would eventually produce professional competitions, magazines, and a global aesthetic ideal had its roots in the training halls where the little pink pill was being distributed with the casualness of a vitamin supplement. The medical indications for which Dianabol had been approved were real but limited, and they were quietly secondary to the drug's actual usage pattern from almost the beginning. CBER's marketing to physicians was broad and optimistic in the manner of 1950s pharmaceutical advertising, presenting methandrostenolone as useful for a wide range of conditions including, at various points, aging and debility, categories expansive enough to encompass essentially anyone a motivated physician wanted to treat. This was not unique to Dianabol. It reflected the regulatory and marketing environment of the era. But it meant that the drug's presence in medicine was always somewhat at odds with its presence in sport, a dual existence that would become increasingly uncomfortable as public awareness of performance-enhancing steroid use grew. The physiological effects of Dianabol are a concentrated version of what testosterone does, amplified by modifications to the molecule that increase its anabolic potency and reduce somewhat, not completely, its androgenic effects. Protein synthesis increases dramatically. Nitrogen retention improves, meaning the body holds on to more of the building blocks of muscle. Glycogenolysis, the process by which muscle cells access glucose for energy, accelerates. The net result is that training harder produces more muscle faster than it would without the drug, and recovery between training sessions is substantially shorter. For a competitive weightlifter or sprinter in the 1960s, this was not a subtle advantage. It was the difference between competing and dominating. Ziegler, who administered the drug to his athletes in carefully controlled doses, watched with mounting dismay as those athletes passed the compound along to others who did not follow his protocols. Where he had prescribed 5 milligrams daily, users were taking 10, 20, 50 times that amount on the theory that if some was good, more was better, a theory that has never, in the history of pharmacology, ended well. The liver damage, cardiovascular changes, and hormonal disruption that follow supraphysiological steroid use were not theoretical concerns he was being overly cautious about. They were outcomes he was watching occur in people he knew. His later public statements about Dianabol were those of a man who had set something in motion and could not stop it and knew it, which is a particular kind of regret that sits quietly and doesn't resolve. Here is the part where the science replaces the mythology, which is worth doing because the mythology has done a lot of damage in both directions, making steroids sound like either miracle compounds or instant catastrophe depending on who's selling you something. Anabolic-androgenic steroids, the class of compounds that includes testosterone and its synthetic relatives, work by binding to androgen receptors in your cells and telling your DNA to increase protein synthesis, which is the process by which your body builds muscle tissue. They also reduce recovery time, increase red blood cell production, and decrease the amount of time your body spends in a catabolic, or muscle breaking down, state. The androgen receptor is the molecular mechanism through which all of this happens. It is a protein found in the nucleus of your cells that, when bound by testosterone or a synthetic androgen, activates specific genes responsible for muscle growth, bone density, and various secondary sexual characteristics. Think of it as a keyhole, and testosterone as a key that unlocks a particular set of instructions in your DNA. Synthetic anabolic steroids are keys that fit the same lock, some of them more precisely than testosterone itself, some of them designed to activate the lock-in muscle tissue preferentially, while reducing activation in tissues where androgenic effects are less desired, like the prostate or the skin. Whether those designs succeed is a matter that clinical evidence has answered with varying degrees of enthusiasm depending on the specific compound. The anabolic seeing muscle building effects of these compounds are mediated through several mechanisms running simultaneously. First, protein synthesis. The rate at which your cells build new protein from amino acids increases, meaning that the training stimulus you provide produces more muscle repair and growth than it would at baseline testosterone levels. Second, nitrogen retention. Muscle tissue is approximately 16% nitrogen by mass, and a positive nitrogen balance, retaining more nitrogen than you excrete, is a reliable indicator of muscle protein being built and stored. Anabolic steroids shift the body into a state of pronounced positive nitrogen balance, meaning more building and less breakdown. Third, satellite cell activation. Satellite cells are muscle stem cells responsible for repairing damaged muscle fiber and generating new fiber after intense exercise. Anabolic steroids increase the activation and proliferation of these cells, potentially allowing the muscle to grow in ways that baseline physiology would not support. The androgenic effects, the masculinizing effects, run in parallel and cannot be entirely separated from the anabolic ones. This is not a technical failure of the pharmaceutical chemists who spent decades trying to develop purely anabolic steroids with no androgenic properties. It is a fundamental limitation imposed by biology. The androgen receptor does not neatly compartmentalize its functions. Activating it in muscle also activates it in the prostate, the skin, the hair follicles, the liver, and the brain, each of which responds in its own way to elevated androgenic signaling. The acne, the hair loss, the prostate enlargement, the aggression. These are not bugs in a poorly designed drug. They are the same mechanism that builds the muscle, expressing itself in tissues that were not the target. What steroids do not do is replace training. This is a persistent misconception worth addressing directly. Anabolic steroids amplify the adaptations produced by exercise. They do not produce those adaptations in the absence of exercise. A person who uses anabolic steroids and does not train will gain some muscle and lose some fat due to the hormonal environment, but they will not gain the muscle of a person who trains hard with the same hormonal support. The drug and the training work together. The drug alone is an amplifier without a signal, which means that everything you've heard about professional athletes on steroids still training extraordinarily hard is true. The steroids made their hard training more productive. They did not substitute for it. This does not make the use more acceptable in contexts where it's banned, it simply makes it more honest. The promotional materials for Dianabol in the late 1950s were not especially forthcoming about what happened when you took it for extended periods. The side effects of anabolic steroids, which reveal themselves slowly and sometimes irreversibly, include liver damage, elevated blood pressure, unfavorable changes in cholesterol levels, suppression of the body's natural testosterone production, testicular atrophy, acne severe enough to constitute its own medical emergency, and, in the category of outcomes that feel cosmically unfair, accelerated male pattern baldness, a side effect caused by the conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, meaning that taking more of the hormone responsible for hair growth can directly cause hair loss, which is the sort of biological irony that makes you wonder if evolution has a sense of humour. The cardiovascular effects are among the most serious and least dramatic in their presentation. Anabolic steroids alter the ratio of high-density lipoprotein to low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, reducing the good cholesterol and often increasing the bad, in ways that accelerate atherosclerosis, the build-up of plaques in arterial walls that underlies most heart attacks and strokes. They also increase left ventricular mass. The wall of the heart's main pumping chamber thickens, a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, when it occurs without pharmaceutical cause, and one that carries real risk of sudden cardiac death in severe cases. The timeline on these effects is years to decades rather than weeks to months, which means they are easy to discount in the short term and difficult to attribute definitively in the long term, since the person who has a heart attack at 52 might have had one anyway, might have had it earlier without the drugs, might have had it later with better lifestyle management. The epidemiology is real. The individual case is always uncertain. Liver toxicity is most closely associated with oral anabolic steroids, particularly those modified with a chemical change called C17-alpha alkylation, which protects the compound from being broken down in the liver on its first pass through the digestive system, but simultaneously increases the liver's chemical burden. Elevated liver enzymes, pileosis hepatis, blood-filled cysts in the liver, and in rare cases liver tumours, including a rare benign tumour called hepatic adenoma and the rather less benign hepatocellular carcinoma, are all documented consequences of prolonged oral anabolic steroid use at supraphysiological doses. Injectable steroids bypass the first-pass liver metabolism and produce less hepatotoxicity, which is one reason that experienced users often prefer injectable compounds for extended cycles. This is the kind of harm reduction reasoning that operates inside a framework most physicians find difficult to engage with, since the recommended framework is don't use them at all, but the harm reduction reasoning is not wrong on its own terms. The hormonal suppression is perhaps the effect that surprises users most, because it works against the very goal the drugs are meant to serve, introducing large amounts of exogenous testosterone signals to the hypothalamus and pituitary gland that the body has more than enough androgens, and that endogenous production can be reduced or stopped. The testes, receiving no signal to produce testosterone, reduce their activity and physically shrink, testicular atrophy, which is a side effect that tends to prompt an urgent reassessment of priorities. More significantly, when the exogenous steroid is discontinued, the recovery of natural testosterone production can be prolonged and incomplete, leaving users in a state of low testosterone for weeks or months, with all the fatigue, mood disruption, and physical regression that entails. Post-cycle therapy, the use of compounds like clomiphene or human chorionic gonadotropin to stimulate the recovery of natural testosterone production, exists precisely because this recovery does not always happen on its own at an acceptable pace. The fine print, as always, continues to get longer the further in you read. Nandrolone, marketed originally as decadurabolin, was introduced in 1962 by the pharmaceutical company Organon and quickly became one of the most widely used injectable anabolic steroids in both medicine and sport, which is a sentence that describes two very different populations using it for reasons that overlap only occasionally. In medicine, nandrolone found legitimate application in the treatment of anemia, osteoporosis, and muscle-wasting conditions. In sport, it found application in the locker rooms of athletes who appreciated that it produced significant muscle gains with a somewhat lower risk of the androgenic side effects that made other steroids more visible and therefore more incriminating. Nandrolone is a modified form of testosterone in which the carbon-19 position has been removed, a modification so minor from a structural standpoint and so significant in its pharmacological consequences that it illustrates how precisely tuned steroid chemistry had become by the early 1960s. The absence of that carbon atom reduces the compound's androgenic potency relative to its anabolic potency, meaning that muscle-building effects are preserved while the masculinizing effects, acne, scalp hair loss, prostate stimulation, are somewhat reduced. It also converts to a different metabolite than testosterone does through the aromatization pathway, producing smaller amounts of estrogen and larger amounts of dihydronandrolone, which has weaker androgenic activity. For athletes and physicians both, these properties made nandrolone an attractive option compared to testosterone or Dianabol for applications requiring sustained anabolic effect with manageable side effects. The ester attached to nandrolone in the decadurabolin formulation, decanoate, is what gives the compound its practical pharmacokinetics. Esters are chemical modifications that slow the release of the active compound from the injection site. The decanoate ester produces a very slow release, with blood levels rising gradually over days and remaining elevated for weeks after a single injection. This means infrequent injections, typically once per week or once every 2 weeks, rather than the daily or every other day schedule required by shorter-acting compounds. For patients, this is a convenience. For athletes, it is also a consideration in terms of timing detection windows, a thought process that anti-doping authorities became progressively better equipped to frustrate. The detection of nandrolone became a significant story in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when multiple high-profile athletes tested positive for nandrolone metabolites and mounted defenses that had varying degrees of success. Some claimed inadvertent contamination through food supplements, a claim that had some supporting evidence, since nandrolone precursors were found in certain supplement products. Others claimed contamination through naturally occurring precursors produced by the body under extreme training conditions, a claim that generated substantial scientific debate and was ultimately not supported by the majority of the evidence. The controversy illustrated something important about doping detection. A positive test is the beginning of a legal and scientific argument, not the end of one, and the argument is always more complicated than the headline. On September 24, 1988, Ben Johnson crossed the finish line of the 100-metre sprint at the Seoul Olympics in 9.79 seconds. A world record, a moment of thunderous glory, the single most electric performance in the history of a very fast event. 72 hours later, he was stripped of his gold medal after a post-race drug test returned positive for stanozolol, a synthetic anabolic steroid originally developed in the 1960s for medical use in humans and horses, which is a detail the press found especially useful. The Ben Johnson affair didn't create anti-doping policy, but it burned it into the public consciousness with a clarity that no amount of policy language could have managed on its own. Stanozolol was developed by Winthrop Laboratories and approved in the United States in 1962 under the trade name Winstrol. Its medical applications included the treatment of hereditary angioedema, a condition causing episodes of severe swelling, as well as anemia and muscle-wasting diseases. It was also extensively used in veterinary medicine, which is where the headline writers found their most resonant comparison. The same drug that had been tested on horses had just turned up in the urine of the fastest man alive. This was, objectively speaking, a very effective piece of sports journalism, even if the comparison was somewhat reductive. Stanozolol's pharmacological profile is distinctive among anabolic steroids for several reasons. It does not aromatize into estrogen, meaning users do not experience water retention or the estrogenic side effects associated with testosterone-based compounds, which makes it useful for athletes in weight class sports or disciplines where lean mass is preferred over total mass. It is highly anabolic relative to its androgenic potency. It's available in both oral and injectable forms, and unusually the injectable form is a water suspension rather than an oil solution, meaning it is more painful to inject and has a shorter detection window than oil-based injectables. This shorter detection window is relevant. Stanozolol metabolites can be identified in urine testing for weeks after the last dose, but the window is shorter than some compounds, and it was apparently this window that Johnson's preparation had failed to account for correctly. The aftermath of the sole disqualification was sprawling and strange. The investigation that followed, the Dubin inquiry conducted in Canada, revealed that anabolic steroid use was far more widespread in elite athletics than the public had understood. That Johnson's coach Charlie Francis had structured his entire training program around the use of performance-enhancing drugs, and that Johnson himself had been using steroids since at least 1981. The gold medal passed to Carl Lewis, who had his own history with positive tests for stimulants, disclosed, contested, and ultimately excused in a process that struck many observers as selective. The affair's lasting effect was not the clean outcome that the Olympic authorities had hoped to demonstrate. It was the revelation that the problem was systemic and that the response to it would need to be systemic too. A conclusion that the world of anti-doping took another 15 years to fully act upon. There is a moment in almost every conversation about steroids when someone, well-meaning, confident, slightly wrong, conflates two entirely different classes of compounds because they share a word, and that word is steroid. Corticosteroids, the class that includes prednisone, cortisone, hydrocortisone, and the inhaler your asthmatic cousin carries everywhere, are anti-inflammatory agents that mimic cortisol. Anabolic-androgenic steroids, the class that includes testosterone, Dianabol, and the compounds associated with bodybuilding and athletic cheating scandals, are performance-enhancing agents that mimic testosterone. These are not the same thing in action, intent, or consequence, and the confusion between them has produced decades of misunderstanding in both directions. The structural relationship between the two classes is real. Both are built on the 4-ring carbon scaffold that defines all steroids, but so is the relationship between a cup of coffee and a methamphetamine molecule, in the sense that both contain nitrogen and both affect alertness. But you would not describe them as equivalent or interchangeable to someone who needed to know the difference. The shared word steroid is a chemical family designation, not a descriptor of effect, risk, or purpose. Using it as though it described a single unified thing is the biochemical equivalent of saying all birds fly and then being confused when you encounter an ostrich. The practical consequences of this confusion are documented in clinical settings and in public discourse. On one side, patients with conditions requiring corticosteroid treatment sometimes delay or refuse medication because they associate the word steroid with the compounds they've seen discussed in the context of doping scandals, and they do not want those. This is a medically meaningful problem. Inadequately treated asthma, autoimmune flares, and inflammatory conditions have real consequences, and it stems entirely from a nomenclature problem rather than from any genuine risk calculation. On the other side, people using anabolic steroids occasionally reassure themselves or others by noting that doctors prescribe steroids for everything, which is true of corticosteroids and not meaningfully true of anabolic steroids in the same context, and which represents the confusion running in the opposite direction to equally unhelpful effect. There is a third category worth introducing here, which is mineralocorticoids, steroids that regulate salt and water balance, primarily through the hormone aldosterone, that get even less public attention than either of the other two, and are primarily relevant in the context of conditions like Addison's disease, where the adrenal glands fail to produce sufficient cortisol or aldosterone. This class is not typically what anyone means when they say steroids in any casual context, but it exists, and its existence is a reminder that the steroid family is a broad biochemical category encompassing compounds with radically different physiological roles that happen to share an architectural skeleton. The skeleton is the thing they have in common. Everything else, what they do, where they do it, who should take them, what happens when they're misused, is entirely specific to the individual compound. The confusion comes from treating the skeleton as the whole story. It is not. Trenbolone was not developed for humans, it was developed for cattle. Specifically, it was designed to increase lean muscle mass in livestock before slaughter, a practical agricultural goal that becomes considerably less comfortable to contemplate when you realize the same compound has been used by human athletes and bodybuilders for roughly as long as anyone has known it existed. Trenbolone is approximately 5 times more potent as an androgen than testosterone, does not aromatize into estrogen, produces dramatic changes in body composition with unusual speed, and comes with a side effect profile that experienced users describe using language that suggests they are not entirely comfortable with some of the things they have experienced. The compound's origins are in the late 1960s, when researchers at Roussel-Aclave in France developed it as an agent for improving feed efficiency in cattle, the ratio of weight gained to food consumed, which is the metric that makes a beef animal economically valuable. Trenbolone acetate in the form of pellets implanted subcutaneously behind the ear of the animal became widely used in the American beef industry and remains so today. When you eat commercially raised beef in the United States, there is a meaningful probability that the animal it came from was treated with Trenbolone acetate, which is a thought that tends to make people either philosophical or immediately vegetarian depending on their disposition. The human use of Trenbolone presented a practical problem from the beginning. The compound formulated for veterinary use, Finajet, later Finaplex, was not available for human pharmaceutical use because no pharmaceutical company had developed a human-grade injectable formulation once the veterinary product was discontinued. The solution adopted by the bodybuilding community was, by the standards of pharmaceutical improvisation, relatively sophisticated. Conversion kits were sold to allow users to dissolve the veterinary pellets in a solvent, filter the solution, and produce an injectable preparation at home. This process, which involves chemistry equipment, the risk of contamination, and a compound whose appropriate human dosing has never been clinically established, became surprisingly standardized within its subculture, complete with written guides and community expertise about which solvents produce the best results. The medical establishment's view of this practice can be summarized as, "Do not do this." The side effects of Trenbolone are reported by users with an unusual degree of specificity and alarm. In addition to the standard anabolic steroid profile, cardiovascular strain, hormonal suppression, aggression, Trenbolone is associated with several effects that users attribute to its high affinity for the progesterone receptor, including a particular form of anxiety and insomnia, sometimes described colloquially as treninsomnia, characterized by vivid nightmares, night sweats, and severely disrupted sleep. Users also report a phenomenon called tren cough, a severe coughing episode immediately following injection, attributed to a small amount of compound entering the bloodstream directly during injection. The combination of dramatic physical results and consistently alarming side effects has given Trenbolone a reputation within the communities that use it as a compound reserved for the experienced and the determined, which is a description that raises questions about the definition of both of those words in this context. Human growth hormone, or HGH, is produced naturally by your pituitary gland and is responsible for cell growth, regeneration, and the maintenance of healthy tissue throughout your body. Children with growth hormone deficiency were among the first to receive synthetic HGH when it became available in the early 1980s, and the results were medically significant. Children who would have remained severely undersized grew to normal height, and patients with certain wasting conditions experienced genuine improvement in quality of life. Then, gradually and then rapidly, the same compound began appearing in entirely different contexts: anti-aging clinics, sports medicine offices, and the recovery protocols of athletes who had access to enough money and enough distance from the rules to use it freely. The history of HGH in medicine before the synthetic version is its own uncomfortable chapter. Prior to the development of recombinant DNA technology, growth hormone for medical use was extracted from the pituitary glands of human cadavers, a process that was effective and for decades considered safe, until it was discovered in the 1980s that some batches were contaminated with the prion responsible for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a fatal neurodegenerative condition with an incubation period measured in years. Patients who had received cadaveric HGH in the 1960s and 70s began developing CJD in the 80s and beyond. The cadaveric extraction program was terminated. Recombinant HGH, produced through genetic engineering in bacterial cells, replaced it in 1985, a safer, scalable supply that coincidentally became available at exactly the moment that athletic doping programs were looking for the next frontier beyond anabolic steroids. HGH's appeal to athletes was multifaceted. It promotes the growth and maintenance of muscle tissue, increases fat metabolism, and, crucially for the sports in which it became most prevalent, accelerates the healing of connective tissue, tendons and ligaments, which recover from injury substantially more slowly than muscle, and which represent the limiting factor in many elite athletes' training volume, respond to growth hormone in ways that allow faster return from injury and possibly greater tolerance of training load. This last property made HGH particularly attractive in football, cycling and baseball, sports with long seasons, high injury rates, and substantial financial incentives for returning to play quickly. Detection of HGH abuse lags significantly behind its use. The compound is produced naturally and is present in blood at varying concentrations depending on age, sleep, exercise, and nutrition, making it difficult to distinguish exogenous use from natural variation through simple measurement. Tests eventually developed by anti-doping laboratories measure either the ratio of HGH isoforms. The exogenous compound differs slightly in its molecular composition from endogenously produced hormone or downstream markers of HGH activity in the blood. These tests have a limited window of detection, generally days rather than weeks, which means that athletes who time their use carefully can benefit from the compound while being clean at the testing event. This is not a small number of athletes. The best available evidence suggests HGH use in elite sport is widespread, and the detection rate does not reflect the prevalence. It reflects the gap between the chemistry and the testing, which remains real. Erythropoietin, known universally as EPO, is a hormone produced by your kidneys that stimulates the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. When you move to high altitude and your oxygen supply drops, your kidneys release more EPO, your red blood cell count rises, and your capacity to deliver oxygen to your muscles improves, a perfectly elegant adaptation that took endurance athletes roughly 4 seconds to recognize as something they could replicate with a syringe. Synthetic EPO became available in the late 1980s for the treatment of anemia associated with kidney disease and cancer chemotherapy. Within years of its approval, it had become the defining compound of professional cycling's most catastrophic era, a period during which it was used so broadly in the peloton that riders who chose not to take it were reportedly told they had no realistic prospect of competing at the highest level. The physiological benefit of EPO to an endurance athlete is straightforward and significant. Red blood cells carry oxygen from the lungs to the working muscles. More red blood cells mean more oxygen delivery, which means higher sustainable power output, faster race times, and faster recovery between efforts. The natural hematocrit, the percentage of blood volume occupied by red blood cells, in a healthy adult male is approximately 40 to 48%. EPO use can elevate this to 60% or higher, a change that translates to measurable, substantial improvements in endurance performance. In a sport decided by margins of seconds over hours, this is not a marginal advantage. The danger of elevated hematocrit became apparent in the late 1980s and early 1990s when a cluster of deaths among professional cyclists, including several who died in their sleep, apparently of cardiac arrest, raised the uncomfortable possibility that their blood had become viscous enough to clot fatally when their resting heart rates dropped during sleep. The deaths were never formally attributed to EPO use. It is very difficult to establish a cause of death as EPO-related when EPO use is undisclosed. But the temporal coincidence between the appearance of synthetic EPO in the peloton and the cluster of deaths was noted by anyone paying attention, and some cyclists reported setting alarms to wake themselves during the night to exercise briefly and keep their blood moving, a precaution that tells you everything you need to know about the cost-benefit analysis that was being made. The story of EPO and professional cycling intersects most dramatically with Lance Armstrong, whose 7 consecutive Tour de France victories from 1999 through 2005 were celebrated as one of sport's most remarkable stories before being revealed, through a combination of USADA investigation and Armstrong's own eventual admission, to have been enabled by a sophisticated and systematic doping program. Armstrong's case was notable not only for the scale of the doping involved, EPO, testosterone, cortisone, HGH, blood transfusions, but for the institutional support it had received, the lengths to which the program had gone to evade detection, and the aggression with which Armstrong had attacked those who told the truth about it for years before the truth could no longer be suppressed. His legacy is a complicated object lesson in what happens when an extraordinary amount of talent, competitive drive, and pharmaceutical assistance are combined and then defended past the point where defense was defensible. In 2003, federal agents raided the Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, a sports nutrition company operating out of Burlingame, California, and uncovered what amounted to a custom steroid manufacturing operation designed not to sell existing compounds, but to engineer new ones that current drug tests could not identify. The key compound was THG, or tetrahydrogestrinone, a designer steroid nicknamed the Clear because it could be administered in liquid form under the tongue and left no detectable trace in standard testing. The client list for Balco services included some of the most prominent names in American professional sport, which made the subsequent criminal proceedings a remarkably well-attended spectator event. Victor Conti, who ran Balco, was not a scientist with formal pharmaceutical training. He was a former musician and self-taught nutritionist who had developed, through a combination of reading, networking, and a remarkable willingness to experiment on elite athletes, a detailed practical knowledge of steroid chemistry and anti-doping testing protocols. His ability to design THG, a compound that existing tests could not detect because those tests were designed to look for known compounds, rested on his understanding that anti-doping testing was a catalogue system rather than a comprehensive screening system. If you could introduce a compound that wasn't in the catalogue, the test would not find it. THG was not in the catalogue. It was in the catalogue for approximately 15 minutes after a coach anonymously mailed a syringe containing it to the United States Anti-Doping Agency, at which point the agency's chemists developed a detection method, and the catalogue was updated. The Balco investigation, conducted jointly by the FBI, the IRS and the US Anti-Doping Agency, produced guilty pleas from Conte and several associates on charges, including illegal steroid distribution and money laundering. The athlete clients were treated differently under the legal framework of the time. They were witnesses, not defendants, and while many gave grand jury testimony that became public through a leak, most faced consequences administered through their sport's own disciplinary systems rather than criminal courts. Marion Jones, the sprinter, was the highest-profile athlete to face criminal conviction, ultimately pleading guilty to lying to federal investigators, not to using drugs, but to denying drug use, and serving a 6-month prison sentence. The lasting significance of Balco was not the individual cases it produced. It was the demonstration that doping technology had advanced to a point where it could outpace testing, not through volume, but through innovation, where the limiting factor in avoiding detection was not access to enough of a known compound, but the capacity to engineer something new. This was a fundamentally different kind of problem than the one anti-doping authorities had been dealing with through the 1980s and 90s. The WADA response, investing heavily in research into detecting previously unknown compounds, developing stored sample testing programs that could retest archive samples when new detection methods became available, was shaped directly by what Balco revealed about the future of the problem. In the sustained public conversation about anabolic steroids, which has been dominated since the 1980s by doping scandals, congressional hearings, and the visual evidence provided by various professional wrestling organizations, the legitimate medical applications have struggled to get a word in edgewise. Testosterone replacement therapy is prescribed for men with clinically low testosterone, a condition called hypergonadism, and the evidence for its benefits in this population is substantial. Improved mood, energy, sexual function, muscle mass, and bone density. Anabolic steroids are also used in the treatment of delayed puberty in adolescent males, severe anemia, muscle wasting diseases, certain breast cancers, and conditions associated with HIV infection. A list of applications that does not make for exciting headlines, but does represent genuinely useful medicine. The HIV connection is one of the more interesting chapters in the medical history of anabolic steroids, and one of the least discussed in the broader cultural conversation. The wasting syndrome associated with advanced HIV infection, characterized by severe loss of muscle mass, weight loss, and profound fatigue, was one of the defining features of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and early 90s, and its management was a central concern of AIDS medicine before the introduction of effective antiretroviral therapy. Testosterone and other anabolic steroids were studied in this context and found to produce genuine benefit in HIV-positive patients, with wasting, restoring muscle mass, improving quality of life, and in some studies appearing to extend survival. This was medicine using a compound that the public associated with cheating athletes to address suffering in a population that was, at that historical moment, receiving inadequate attention from virtually every relevant institution. The muscle-wasting application extends beyond HIV to cancer cachexia, the severe muscle and weight loss that accompanies advanced malignancies and significantly worsens prognosis and quality of life, and to various other conditions involving involuntary muscle wasting, severe burns, long-term corticosteroid use, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, chronic renal failure. In each of these contexts, the evidence for anabolic steroid benefit varies in strength, and the risk-benefit calculation differs, but the clinical rationale is the same. The body's ability to maintain muscle mass is compromised, and restoring anabolic signaling can improve outcomes in ways that matter to the patient. This is the same mechanism that performance-enhancing athletes exploit, applied to populations in genuine medical need, and the moral distinction between these two uses of the same biology is, in the end, not a chemical one. It is a contextual one. Oxandrolone, sold as Anavar, is worth noting in this context as the anabolic steroid most commonly used in these medical applications today. It was developed in the 1960s, is orally administered, has a relatively mild side effect profile compared to many other anabolic steroids, and has maintained FDA approval for the treatment of weight loss in certain medical contexts. It is also among the most commonly counterfeited and diverted anabolic steroids in bodybuilding and athletic circles, which is an irony that physicians who prescribe it for burn patients find understandably frustrating. The compound doesn't distinguish between its uses, the people managing its use do. One of the biological complications that nobody who sells you a steroid narrative is particularly eager to discuss is aromatization, the enzymatic process by which the body converts excess testosterone and certain other anabolic steroids into estrogen. This is not a malfunction. It is a normal regulatory response, the body's way of maintaining hormonal balance in the face of elevated androgens. The problem is that in the context of supraphysiological steroid use, aromatization can produce estrogen levels high enough to cause gynecomastia, the development of breast tissue in male bodies, a side effect that has historically been addressed through the use of aromatase inhibitors and selective estrogen receptor modulators, both of which are their own class of pharmaceuticals with their own profiles of effects and complications, meaning that the management of steroid side effects has essentially generated a secondary pharmacology. The aromatase enzyme is present in multiple tissues throughout the body, including fat tissue, the liver, the brain, and the gonads. Its job under normal physiological conditions is to convert a small amount of testosterone to estradiol, which, in male bodies as well as female ones, plays important roles in bone density, cardiovascular health, libido, and cognitive function. This is not optional biology. Men with complete aromatase deficiency due to rare genetic mutations have severely reduced bone density and other health problems, which is the experimental evidence that estrogen in male bodies is not a side effect to be eliminated but a necessary component of normal male physiology. The problem with supraphysiological androgen use is not that aromatization exists. It is that it proceeds at an elevated rate proportional to the elevated substrate, producing estrogen levels that exceed the physiological range for male bodies and cause tissue effects. Specifically, the stimulation of breast glandular tissue that cannot be reversed without surgery once they are established. The management of aromatization-related side effects in the doping context has driven the adoption of aromatase inhibitors, compounds like anastrozole and letrozole, originally developed for the treatment of estrogen receptor-positive breast cancer in postmenopausal women, as a routine component of anabolic steroid cycles. This is not how these drugs were intended to be used. They are effective in this context. They also carry their own risks. Suppressing estrogen too aggressively in a male body produces the same bone density problems, joint pain, and mood disruption that estrogen deficiency causes in any context. The therapeutic window between enough estrogen and too much estrogen is narrow, and managing it without clinical monitoring is by definition guesswork. The polypharmacy that results, anabolic steroid, aromatase inhibitor, sometimes estrogen receptor modulator as well, means that the person using these compounds is managing not one drug's effects, but a cascading system of interacting drugs, each introduced to manage the side effects of the previous one, which is a pattern that should be familiar to anyone who has read a medication guide for a chronic disease. The history of anti-doping testing is, at its core, a story about the gap between the people trying to catch something and the people trying not to be caught, a gap that has widened and narrowed in alternating cycles since the International Olympic Committee introduced systematic drug testing at the 1968 Mexico City Games. The earliest tests were relatively simple and could detect only the presence of certain stimulants. Anabolic steroid testing arrived in 1976, initially through a urine test developed by Manfred Doniche that could identify synthetic testosterone by measuring the ratio of testosterone to epitestosterone in a sample. Athletes and their pharmacists responded, as they consistently have, by finding the edge of the test's sensitivity and staying just inside it, microdosing, timing cycles to the competition calendar, and eventually commissioning the development of compounds that testing technology had never seen before. The testosterone to epitestosterone ratio test, the TE test, was the first sophisticated steroid detection method and remains part of the testing toolkit today. The principle is straightforward. In a body producing testosterone naturally, the ratio of testosterone to epitestosterone in urine is relatively stable, typically close to 1:1. Introducing exogenous testosterone raises the testosterone side of that ratio without proportionally raising the epitestosterone, producing a ratio that triggers the test at a threshold of approximately 4:1. Athletes learn to stay below that threshold by using smaller doses timed further from testing events. They also learned eventually that individual athletes have naturally varying TE ratios, and the introduction of the athlete biological passport, a longitudinal record of an individual athlete's biological markers over time, measuring change from their own baseline rather than against a population average, represented the most significant methodological improvement in the system since the TE test itself. The stored sample testing program, introduced formally in the wake of the Balco scandal and now a standard feature of Olympic testing, allows samples to be kept for 10 years and retested when new detection methods become available. This has produced a remarkable series of retroactive disqualifications, athletes whose samples were clean at the time of collection and are now positive against a more sophisticated test, and has fundamentally altered the risk calculation for doping. The cheater must now consider not only current testing technology, but the possibility that future technology will find what current technology cannot. The statute of limitations for doping violations has, in some jurisdictions, been extended specifically to accommodate the retest window. Whether this is sufficient deterrent is debated. The evidence suggests it is a meaningful one. The World Anti-Doping Agency, established in 1999 in the wake of the Tour de France scandal that year, and the continuing revelations about the scale of doping in professional sport, represents the institutional attempt to coordinate this effort globally, standardizing testing protocols, maintaining the prohibited list, funding research, and managing the international legal framework of appeals. It is an imperfect institution, subject to political pressures from national sporting bodies and governments, with varying commitments to clean sport, and its record of enforcement has been uneven across sports and regions. The battles with Russia over state-sponsored doping, culminating in the evidence uncovered in the McLaren report in 2016, revealed the limits of a voluntary system relying on cooperation from nations that had decided at the highest governmental level to subvert it. The gap between the testing and the behaviour being tested is smaller than it was in 1988. It has not closed. The story of anabolic steroids in women's sport is told less often than it deserves, partly because women's sport was afforded less institutional attention during the decades when doping was most pervasive, and partly because the evidence, when it did surface, was often more systematic and more harrowing than anything seen in men's competition. The East German state doping program, known internally as State Plan Research Theme 14.25 and running from approximately 1974 through the fall of the Berlin Wall, administered anabolic steroids, primarily oral Dianabol, to thousands of athletes, many of them women, many of them teenagers, the majority of them unaware of what they were being given. The consequences were documented by a sports doctor named Werner Franke, and his wife, historian Brigitte Berendonck, who obtained the Stasi files and published them. Liver tumours, cardiovascular disease, masculinizing effects that could not be reversed, psychological damage, and in some cases infertility. Oral Dianabol, the compound at the centre of the East German program, was developed by the pharmaceutical company Genopharm in East Germany in the 1960s, and was one of the first drugs specifically studied in female athletes in a systematic way. Unfortunately, systematically in the sense of being systematically administered without consent to people who had not been told what they were taking. The compound was chosen in part because it did not produce the same degree of water retention as other anabolic steroids, meaning the masculinizing changes it produced were somewhat less immediately obvious, and in part because it was a domestic compound whose production could be controlled entirely within the East German pharmaceutical system. The athletes who came forward after the wall fell described experiences that were consistent across their testimony, receiving pills from coaches described as vitamins, noticing changes in their bodies and voices they had not been warned about, asking questions and being told not to worry, and in some cases developing conditions, liver disease, ovarian cysts, hormonal disorders, joint problems, that they attributed directly to the program. Several brought legal cases. The legal outcomes were largely unsatisfying given the scale of what had been done. Fines rather than imprisonment, settlements rather than admissions. Ines Geipel, a sprinter from the East German national team who later became an author and advocate, described the experience of seeking accountability as its own ordeal, conducted against an institutional resistance to acknowledgement that she found more demoralizing than the original harm. Her work, and the work of others like her, eventually produced a more complete historical record than existed for decades. It did not produce justice in any proportionate sense. The physiological effects of anabolic steroids in female bodies differ from those in male bodies in ways that compound both the potential benefit for athletic performance and the potential for harm. Women's baseline testosterone levels are substantially lower than men's, meaning the relative increase produced by anabolic steroids is proportionally larger, and the androgenic effects, deepening of the voice, clitoral enlargement, changes in body hair, occur at doses lower than those required to produce the same effects in male users. The voice change is of particular note because it is irreversible. The laryngeal changes that produce voice deepening do not reverse when steroid use is discontinued, meaning female athletes who used anabolic steroids for years in their 20s may carry the evidence of it for the rest of their lives, regardless of what they later chose or were forced to disclose. Insulin is not, technically, a steroid. It is a peptide hormone. But it belongs in this conversation because it occupies a significant place in the pharmacology of modern competitive bodybuilding, and because its inclusion illustrates how far the performance enhancement world has moved beyond the testosterone and Dianabol era that most people's mental models are still running on. Insulin's anabolic properties, its role in shuttling glucose and amino acids into muscle cells, and in stimulating protein synthesis, make it attractive to bodybuilders looking to accelerate muscle growth and recovery. The risk associated with its misuse is straightforward and severe. Too much insulin without sufficient carbohydrate intake causes hypoglycemia, which causes brain damage and death with a speed and certainty that distinguishes it from most other compounds in the doping pharmacopoeia. Insulin is produced by the pancreas in response to rising blood glucose, and its primary function is to facilitate the uptake of glucose by cells throughout the body. It is also powerfully anabolic in muscle tissue. It activates protein synthesis pathways, inhibits protein breakdown, and facilitates the entry of amino acids into muscle cells. These properties make it functionally similar to anabolic steroids in its effects on muscle tissue, through a completely different molecular mechanism, which is why it can be used in combination with anabolic steroids for additive effects that neither compound produces alone. Competitive bodybuilders who use insulin typically administer rapid-acting formulations around their workouts during the period when muscle cells are most receptive to the uptake of nutrients, and consume precisely timed carbohydrate and protein loads to direct the insulin's nutrient shuttling effect toward muscle rather than fat. The margin for error with insulin is narrow in a way that is qualitatively different from the risks of most other performance-enhancing compounds. The difference between a therapeutic dose and a dangerous one is measured in units of a drug that comes in concentrations requiring precise calculation, and the consequence of a miscalculation is not a gradual worsening of cardiovascular markers or a slow development of liver enzyme elevation. It is hypoglycemia, blood glucose dropping below the level required for normal brain function, which progresses through confusion, seizure, and loss of consciousness to cardiac arrest and death within minutes if glucose is not administered. Multiple competitive bodybuilders have died or suffered serious brain damage from insulin misuse. The compound is not detectable by standard anti-doping tests because it is also produced naturally, and its measurement requires specific assays not included in routine screens. It is, in the landscape of performance-enhancing drugs, a compound that bypassed the regulatory conversation almost entirely by being invisible to the testing infrastructure that polices everything else. Selective androgen receptor modulators, SARMs, represent the pharmaceutical industry's attempt, beginning in the 1990s, to develop compounds that could deliver the muscle-building and bone-strengthening benefits of anabolic steroids while limiting the androgenic side effects in tissues where they cause problems. The theoretical appeal was genuine, a compound that could prevent muscle wasting in cancer patients or osteoporosis in aging populations without causing prostate growth, cardiovascular changes, or liver stress would be a meaningful medical advance. Several pharmaceutical companies invested heavily in SARM research. Most of those programs were eventually discontinued. The compounds nonetheless escaped into the supplement market, where they are sold, often without acknowledgement of what they actually are, to people who believe they are purchasing something safer than traditional steroids, a belief for which the current evidence provides limited support. The science behind SARMs is real, and the concept is not without merit. Traditional anabolic steroids bind to androgen receptors throughout the body and activate them relatively uniformly, producing anabolic effects in muscle and bone alongside androgenic effects in the prostate, skin and scalp, and estrogenic effects through aromatization. SARMs were designed to be tissue selective, to activate androgen receptors in muscle and bone while having minimal activity in prostate tissue and reduced activity in other androgenic tissues. This tissue selectivity is achieved through differences in the three-dimensional shape of the SARM molecule compared to testosterone, which causes it to bind the androgen receptor in a slightly different configuration, recruiting different signaling proteins and producing different patterns of gene activation in different tissue types. The concept is elegant. The execution in human clinical trials has been more complicated. These SARMs that progressed furthest in clinical development, compounds like Osterin, Ligandrol and RAD140, demonstrated promising results in Phase 1 and Phase 2 trials for muscle wasting and osteoporosis before encountering problems in later stages. Liver toxicity, cardiovascular effects, suppression of endogenous testosterone that, while less severe than that produced by traditional anabolic steroids, was still clinically significant and not the clean safety profile the developers had hoped to achieve. Several programs were terminated. None has received regulatory approval for any indication as of the time this script was written. The compounds are legally classified as investigational drugs with no approved use, which means, technically, that the grey market sale of them as dietary supplements involves selling unapproved drugs under a label that does not say unapproved drug. The marketing language around SARMs in the supplement industry has, since their emergence in online markets in the early 2000s, been creative in ways that regulatory agencies have found challenging to address efficiently. They are sold as research chemicals, as not for human consumption, as unnamed proprietary blends in products labelled for other purposes. FDA warning letters have been issued to dozens of companies. The market continues. Independent testing of products marketed as SARMs has found contamination with traditional steroids, incorrect dosing, and in some cases compounds other than those listed on the label. The person who believes they are taking a well-characterized research compound in a known dose is frequently doing none of those things, which adds a layer of pharmacological uncertainty to a risk profile that is already incompletely characterized in the published literature. The safer designation, in this context, is doing a lot of work without much evidence behind it, somewhere between the clean medical use of corticosteroids for genuine inflammatory conditions and the performance enhancement narrative of anabolic doping. There exists a quieter practice: corticosteroid injections administered to professional athletes to manage pain and inflammation well enough to allow competition. This is legal, it is common, it is done with medical supervision, and it is, depending on who you ask and when, either responsible sports medicine or a pharmaceutical intervention that allows athletes to compete through injuries that their bodies are signaling quite urgently should be wrested. The distinction between treating a condition that prevents competition and chemically overriding a warning signal to enable short-term performance is one that sports medicine has been navigating with varying clarity since corticosteroid injections became standard practice in the 1960s. A corticosteroid injection, typically triamcinolone, methylprednisolone, or betamethasone administered directly into a joint, bursa, or tendon sheath, works by delivering a concentrated anti-inflammatory agent to the site of injury, reducing swelling, pain, and the local immune response that produces both. In genuine inflammatory conditions, bursitis, tendinitis, synovitis, this can be genuinely therapeutic, reducing pain and improving function in ways that allow normal activity and, importantly, allow the tissue to heal rather than remaining in a cycle of chronic inflammation. The injection, in these cases, is part of a treatment plan that includes rest, rehabilitation, and modification of the activities causing the problem. In professional sport, the injection is often administered in a different context. The athlete has an injury that would prevent them from competing, a competition or season that represents significant financial and contractual value, and a medical staff whose institutional role is at least partially oriented toward keeping the athlete available rather than keeping them healthy in the long term. The injection allows the competition. Whether it serves the athlete's long-term interest depends on the specific injury, the specific compound, the specific dose, and the subsequent management, questions that the in-season athletic environment is not always structured to answer carefully. There is evidence that repeated corticosteroid injections into the same joint accelerate cartilage degradation, the opposite of what the injections are supposed to achieve, and a growing recognition in sports medicine that the practice of injecting athletes to enable competition has sometimes been used with a frequency and in circumstances that the evidence does not clearly support. The regulatory framework around corticosteroid use in sport is complicated. Local injections of corticosteroids are permitted under the World Anti-Doping Code for most sports, provided they are administered by a physician for a legitimate medical purpose. Oral and intravenous corticosteroids are on the prohibited list during competition, since they have performance-enhancing properties at systemic doses, improving breathing, reducing fatigue perception, enhancing mood, that go beyond local anti-inflammatory effect. The boundary between a therapeutic local injection and a systemic dose with performance-enhancing properties is managed by declaration requirements and medical exemption processes that are in practice imperfectly enforced. The legal grey zone is not a metaphor. It is a regulatory reality that sports medicine professionals, athletes, and anti-doping authorities have been working around for decades. In 1990, the United States Congress passed the Anabolic Steroids Control Act, placing anabolic steroids on Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act, alongside ketamine and certain barbiturates. This followed a period of sustained congressional attention to the issue, driven in part by the Ben Johnson affair, in part by increasing public awareness of steroid use in professional sport, and in part by the distinctly American legislative tendency to criminalize substances at moments of peak public anxiety, and then discover the complexity of the issue later. The hearings themselves produced memorable testimony from physicians, athletes, and, in the 1990s round, representatives of Major League Baseball, whose willingness to treat the question with anything approaching transparency was limited in ways that would become clearer over the following decade. The 1988 hearing, convened in the immediate aftermath of the Seoul Olympics and Ben Johnson's disqualification, brought together a collection of witnesses whose testimony reflected the confusion and alarm of a public institution encountering a complicated scientific and social problem for the first time at volume. Physicians testified about the medical risks. Athletes, some of them former users, some not, described the culture of use in their sports. The American Medical Association testified against scheduling, arguing that the criminal law framework was an inappropriate response to what was primarily a public health and sports governance issue. The AMA's position was scientifically defensible and was largely ignored, because congressional hearings on substances are not primarily about pharmacology. They are about the expression of public concern and the production of a visible legislative response to that concern. The scheduling of anabolic steroids was, by the standards of criminal law drug policy, unusual in one specific respect. The compounds being scheduled had genuine medical uses and were legally manufactured by legitimate pharmaceutical companies for those uses. Scheduling a substance with legitimate medical uses creates a two-tier system in which the medical use continues under prescription, while non-medical use becomes a criminal matter. This structure works reasonably well for substances like opioids, where the medical use is the primary use and the diversion to non-medical use is the problem being addressed. For anabolic steroids, where the non-medical use in sport vastly exceeded the medical use in terms of volume and public visibility, the scheduling created a criminal framework around a practice that had been normalized in gyms and locker rooms for 3 decades, and that the new legal status did not, in practice, significantly disrupt. The 1994 follow-up hearings and the subsequent 2004 revision that added more compounds to the schedule following the Balco investigation repeated the pattern. Congressional attention stimulated by a particular scandal, legislative response designed to address that scandal's visible surface, limited engagement with the structural factors that made doping endemic in the sports most affected. The hearings were not without value. They produced public testimony, established a legal record, and in some cases contributed to meaningful policy. They were also consistently more effective as political performance than as policy mechanism, which is a description that applies to a broader category of American drug policy than steroids alone. In December 2007, former Senator George Mitchell delivered to the Commissioner of Major League Baseball a 209-page report on the use of performance-enhancing drugs in professional baseball, a document that named 89 players, identified networks of supply and use that had operated openly inside the sport for years, and produced a public conversation that the sport had been successfully avoiding since roughly 1988. The Mitchell report was not the end of the conversation. It was more like the moment when everyone agreed to acknowledge that the conversation needed to happen, which is a different thing, and several years more awkward than an actual ending. The era the report described had specific contours. The 1990s in Major League Baseball were a period of escalating offensive statistics that the sports marketing apparatus celebrated enthusiastically. Home run records falling, slugging percentages at levels not seen since the pre-war era, attendance recovering from the disastrous labour stoppage of 1994. The question of why hitters were suddenly so much more productive was not asked loudly by anyone with a financial stake in the answer remaining unexplored. The ballparks were full, the ratings were up, the records were being broken. The relationship between those facts and the pharmaceutical products that certain players' physical transformations between seasons suggested they were using was one that the sports executives, media, and union had collectively decided not to examine with any particular urgency. Mitchell's investigation was limited by its reliance on voluntary cooperation. He had no subpoena power, and the Players' Association advised its members that they were not obligated to speak with him, which most of them did not. His primary sources were two figures with direct operational knowledge of the supply networks. Kirk Radomski, a former Mets clubhouse employee who had been a significant supplier of anabolic steroids and HGH to players across the league, and Brian McNamee, a trainer who had personal knowledge of the doping practices of several prominent players, most famously Roger Clemens. The Clemens section of the report produced the most sustained subsequent legal proceedings, a perjury case against Clemens that ended in acquittal after a complicated trial, and illustrated the difficulty of establishing individual liability from the kind of evidence available in a voluntary investigation without judicial tools. The sport's response to the Mitchell report was a combination of acknowledgement that a problem had existed, commitment to improve testing going forward, and a careful institutional posture that did not require any specific executive to account for having presided over the era being described. The Hall of Fame implications of the steroid era have generated annual debates that show no sign of resolution. A permanent argument about how to evaluate statistics produced in a context of widespread and unequally enforced prohibition, with no clean answer available, which is probably the appropriate outcome for a situation in which there was no clean answer to be had. In the 21st century, testosterone replacement therapy has moved from a narrow medical intervention for men with diagnosed hypogonadism into something considerably broader, a wellness category embraced by men in their 30s, 40s and 50s who do not have a clinical deficiency, but who have been persuaded by a combination of direct-to-consumer advertising, online communities, and the genuine reality of age-related hormonal decline, that their quality of life would be meaningfully improved by supplementing the testosterone their bodies are making slightly less of than they used to. The men's health clinic industry, operating through telehealth platforms, subscription services, and storefront locations in strip malls across America, prescribes testosterone at a scale that would have been unrecognizable to the physicians of 1958, and the debate about where medicine ends and optimization begins has not been resolved to anyone's particular satisfaction. The physiological reality underlying TRT's expansion is not fictitious. Testosterone does decline with age in most men, typically by approximately 1 to 2% per year from the early 30s onward, and the symptoms associated with low testosterone are real. Reduced energy, decreased muscle mass and strength, increased body fat, particularly in the abdominal region, diminished libido, mood changes including depression and irritability, and reduced bone density. These symptoms are non-specific. They overlap with many other conditions and with the normal experience of aging. But in men with genuinely low testosterone levels, they can be substantially improved by replacement therapy, and the evidence for benefit in this population is relatively robust. The controversy is not about whether TRT works for men with hypogonadism. It is about how to define hypogonadism, who meets the definition, and whether the expanding prescription base reflects an expanding disease or an expanding market. The definition of hypogonadism and the testosterone threshold at which treatment is appropriate has been one of the central disputes in endocrinology over the past 2 decades. Clinical guidelines from major endocrine societies generally recommend treatment only when testosterone is below a defined threshold and symptoms are present. Not symptoms alone, not low testosterone alone, but both together. The threshold has varied across guidelines and time periods, partly because the population reference ranges used to define normal have themselves been debated. Testosterone levels vary with age, time of day, body composition, sleep quality, alcohol use, and dozens of other factors, and the reference ranges published by laboratories reflect the distributions of whatever populations they sampled, which have not always been representative of the general population in ways that matter for clinical decision-making. A man in his 50s whose testosterone is at the lower boundary of the reference range derived from a population that skewed younger is in a genuinely ambiguous clinical situation, and the men's health clinic that tells him he is low and the traditional endocrinologist who tells him he is normal may both be operating honestly within the same incomplete data. The direct-to-consumer testosterone clinic model, operating with telehealth consultations, online blood testing services, and mail-order hormone delivery, has lowered the friction of obtaining a prescription to a level that many traditional endocrinologists and primary care physicians find medically concerning. The threshold for prescribing is, in some of these services, significantly lower than what clinical guidelines recommend. Men with testosterone levels at the lower end of the normal range, not deficient by any standard clinical definition, are being prescribed and reporting significant benefit, which creates a genuine interpretive problem. If a man feels better on testosterone and his levels were technically normal beforehand, was he deficient by some individual standard that population norms do not capture? Or is he experiencing the benefits of supraphysiological hormonal optimization, which is functionally different from treatment? The line between those two things does not announce itself, and the clinic collecting the monthly subscription fee has limited financial incentive to draw it carefully. What the expansion of TRT has also produced is a generation of men in their 30s and 40s who are now on exogenous testosterone and will be for the foreseeable future. This is because TRT once started typically cannot be stopped without consequence. The same suppression of endogenous testosterone production that occurs with anabolic steroid use occurs with therapeutic TRT. The hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis downregulates in response to the exogenous hormone, and the testes reduce their own production. A man who has been on TRT for several years and discontinues it does not return smoothly to his pre-treatment baseline. His baseline has been replaced by something lower, often substantially lower, because his endogenous system has been quiet for long enough that its recovery is unreliable. This is not hidden information. It is disclosed in the medical literature and, in responsible practices, discussed with patients before initiation. It is also not always communicated with the weight it deserves in a clinical context where the conversation is framed around the benefits of starting rather than the implications of committing. The social and cultural dimensions of TRT's expansion are worth acknowledging as well. The men's health clinic industry is not operating in a vacuum. It is responding to and reinforcing a cultural narrative about testosterone as a proxy for male vitality, competence, and worth that has significant commercial utility. The framing of low testosterone as a medical condition with a pharmaceutical solution, rather than as one component of normal aging that may or may not require intervention, depending on its severity and its impact on the individual, reflects not just a clinical judgment, but a marketing decision. That marketing decision has been remarkably effective. Testosterone prescriptions in the United States increased roughly tenfold between 2000 and 2015, before the FDA issued guidance requiring labeling changes and more explicit warnings about cardiovascular risk, and the market, after a brief contraction, continued to grow. The compound that started as a treatment for a rare endocrine disorder has become one of the most commercially successful pharmaceutical narratives of the 21st century, which tells you something about the desires it is being sold to address, and rather less about whether it addresses them as reliably as advertised. The long-term cardiovascular safety of TRT has been an area of active research and some controversy. Earlier concerns that testosterone therapy increased cardiovascular risk were followed by studies suggesting the opposite, that men with genuinely low testosterone who received replacement therapy had improved cardiovascular outcomes compared to untreated men with low testosterone estrol. And the current evidence, synthesized in several large meta-analyses, suggests that TRT at appropriate doses in men with clinical hypergonadism does not increase cardiovascular risk and may reduce it. Whether this safety profile extends to men without clinical deficiency who are using TRT for optimization purposes is a different question, less well studied and answered with less confidence. The history of hormone therapy more broadly, the decades-long recommendation of estrogen replacement in postmenopausal women that was subsequently revised when the Women's Health Initiative demonstrated unexpected cardiovascular and cancer risks, provides a cautionary precedent for confidence about long-term hormonal intervention before the long-term data is complete. The testosterone story is not the estrogen story, but the epistemological lesson that confident prescribing at scale ahead of long-term safety data has consequences that emerge slowly and are expensive to reverse, applies across both. Topical corticosteroids, the creams, ointments, and lotions prescribed for eczema, psoriasis, contact dermatitis, and the kind of mysterious rash that appears on your forearm after a weekend camping trip and refuses to explain itself, are the most commonly used class of steroids in the world, and also the one most thoroughly removed from the cultural conversation about what steroids are and what they do. They work by suppressing the local immune response and reducing inflammation in the skin, which is effective, well understood, and, when used as directed, generally quite safe. The complications arise with long-term use of higher potency formulations, skin thinning, altered pigmentation, and, in a development that has generated a growing community of affected patients online, a condition called topical steroid withdrawal, characterized by a severe rebound of skin inflammation when the cream is discontinued, the management of which is both challenging and, until recently, poorly acknowledged by dermatology. Topical corticosteroids are classified by potency into 7 groups, with Group 1 containing the most potent formulations, clobetasol propionate, for example, and Group 7 containing the mildest, including over-the-counter hydrocortisone at low concentrations. The appropriate potency for a given condition depends on the location on the body, the severity of the inflammation, and the age of the patient, since facial skin and the skin of infants absorbs topical medications more readily and is more vulnerable to side effects than the skin of the trunk or extremities in adults. A physician prescribing a high-potency topical steroid for a skin fold or for facial eczema or for prolonged use in a child is making a risk-benefit calculation that requires care, one that becomes more complicated when the prescription is refilled repeatedly without reassessment, which happens more often than the risk-benefit calculus would recommend. The mechanism through which topical corticosteroids work involves multiple anti-inflammatory pathways. They bind to glucocorticoid receptors inside skin cells, which then migrate to the cell nucleus and alter gene expression, reducing the production of inflammatory cytokines, prostaglandins, and leukotrienes, and decreasing the permeability of blood vessels in the skin that allows inflammatory fluid and cells to accumulate in affected tissue. They also suppress the activity of the dendritic cells and T lymphocytes that drive the immune-mediated inflammation characteristic of conditions like eczema and psoriasis. The result in the short term is a reduction in redness, itching, and scaling that can be rapid and dramatic, which is one reason patients use them, return to them, and sometimes continue using them well beyond the period that clinical guidelines would recommend. The skin thinning produced by long-term topical corticosteroid use, a condition called atrophy, results from the suppression of collagen synthesis and the inhibition of skin cell proliferation. It manifests as skin that appears thin, translucent, and bruises or tears easily, a visible, persistent consequence that can be produced by years of daily application of potent topical steroids to the same area. It may also manifest as striae, stretch mark-like lines that appear in areas of repeated application, and as telangiectasia, the dilation of small blood vessels near the skin surface that produces a chronic visible redness. These changes, once established, do not fully reverse when the steroid is discontinued. They are not hypothetical risks to be considered in extreme cases of misuse. They occur in ordinary clinical practice when long-term prescribing is not carefully managed, and they occur in patients who are following their physician's instructions at the doses their physician recommended. Steroid rosacea, a chronic, persistent redness of the face triggered by topical corticosteroid use and exacerbated by its withdrawal, is another well-documented complication that arises from inappropriate use of potent formulations on facial skin, and one that can be more distressing and harder to manage than the original condition for which the steroid was prescribed. Topical steroid withdrawal, or TSW, is the condition that has generated the most patient advocacy in recent years and the most institutional controversy. The syndrome, described by affected patients as involving intense burning, itching, skin redness that spreads beyond the originally treated area, and significant systemic symptoms including fatigue, insomnia, and temperature dysregulation, appears to represent a rebound phenomenon following long-term topical steroid use. The skin's vasodilatory systems, suppressed by years of steroid application, responding with excessive dilation and inflammation when the suppression is removed. The condition was described in the medical literature in the 1970s. The dermatologist Albert Kligman used the term steroid addiction for what he observed in patients unable to discontinue topical steroid application without severe rebound, and then largely disappeared from clinical attention for decades as topical steroids became one of the most reflexively prescribed tools in dermatology. The patient community that organised online in the 2010s and 2020s, documenting their experiences with photographs, sharing management strategies, and advocating for formal recognition from dermatological societies, encountered a medical establishment that was initially resistant to acknowledging the syndrome as a distinct entity, in part because its recognition would implicate a class of treatments that had been widely prescribed without adequate warning about long-term risks. The National Eczema Association acknowledged TSW in 2021. The International Topical Steroid Awareness Network has documented thousands of cases globally. Dermatological guidelines have begun including more explicit discussion of the risk and the need for strategies to minimize long-term dependence. The transition from a patient community's insistence that something real was happening to them to institutional acknowledgement that they were correct took approximately a decade of sustained advocacy, which is not unusual in the history of medicine, and no more comfortable for that. The broader lesson of topical steroids in the modern era is one about the gap between a drug's utility when used appropriately and its consequences when used routinely without sustained clinical oversight. Topical corticosteroids are genuinely effective for the conditions they treat. They are also the most normalized and least examined of the steroid classes, prescribed with a casualness commensurate with their over-the-counter availability at low potency and their decades of routine use at higher potency by prescription. The assumption that a drug is safe because it is familiar is one that the history of medicine has had occasion to revise repeatedly, and topical steroids are one of the cases where that revision is actively underway, quietly, without the congressional hearings and doping scandals that attended the other members of the same chemical family, but with consequences that are, for the people experiencing them, no less real. In June 2020, researchers from the recovery trial in the United Kingdom announced that dexamethasone, a corticosteroid that has been in medical use since 1961, reduced mortality by approximately 1/3 in hospitalized COVID-19 patients who required oxygen or mechanical ventilation. It was the first treatment demonstrated to reduce deaths from COVID-19, and it cost approximately $6 per treatment course in generic form. The announcement was, by the standards of a global pandemic in which every piece of news arrived, surrounded by uncertainty and competing claims, unusually clear and unusually good. Dexamethasone, a 60-year-old steroid that millions of people had been prescribed for inflammatory conditions, had turned out to be among the most useful tools available for keeping people with severe COVID-19 alive. Dexamethasone was developed by Merck in the late 1950s and received FDA approval in 1961. It is a synthetic glucocorticoid, a corticosteroid that acts primarily on the glucocorticoid receptor rather than the mineralocorticoid receptor, and is approximately 25 times more potent than cortisol and about 6 times more potent than prednisone as an anti-inflammatory agent. Its potency relative to prednisone is not just a pharmacological curiosity. It has practical implications for the context in which it is most useful. When a physician needs to rapidly and substantially suppress a dangerous inflammatory process, cerebral edema, anaphylaxis, severe asthma, the hyperinflammation of severe COVID-19, the high potency of dexamethasone means that effective doses are small, which simplifies administration, reduces the volume of fluid required for intravenous delivery, and matters practically in resource-limited settings. It is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, not because it is exotic or sophisticated, but because it is effective, affordable, and available essentially everywhere in the world. The reason dexamethasone worked in severe COVID-19 had to do with the pathophysiology of the disease's most dangerous phase. COVID-19 kills not primarily through direct viral destruction of lung tissue, but through the immune response to the virus, a dysregulated, excessive inflammatory reaction in which the immune system's attempts to fight the infection cause massive inflammation in the lungs that impairs gas exchange and produces respiratory failure. Inflammatory cytokines, signaling proteins that coordinate immune responses, accumulate at levels that damage lung tissue, drive the formation of microclots in pulmonary blood vessels, and contribute to multi-organ dysfunction in severe cases. This is not a unique pattern to COVID-19. It is a common pathological pathway in severe pneumonia, sepsis, and acute respiratory distress syndrome more broadly. What was specific to COVID-19 was the degree to which this immune-mediated damage, rather than direct viral damage, drove mortality in hospitalized patients. In this context, suppressing the inflammatory response with a corticosteroid, which would be contraindicated early in infection, when the immune response is still fighting the virus and suppressing it would worsen outcomes, becomes beneficial later when the immune response has become the primary cause of harm rather than the primary defense against it. The timing distinction matters. Dexamethasone given to patients with mild COVID-19 who do not require oxygen appears to have neutral or possibly negative effects. The inflammatory response in these patients is still doing useful work. Dexamethasone given to patients who require supplemental oxygen or mechanical ventilation, patients in whom the immune-mediated damage is the dominant pathophysiology, saves approximately 1 in 8 patients who would otherwise have died. That fraction of 1 in 8, applied to the global burden of severe COVID-19 hospitalizations, represents an enormous number of lives, achieved with a drug that cost $6 and had been sitting in hospital formularies since the Kennedy administration. The recovery trial, which produced this result, is worth understanding as an achievement in its own right. Randomized controlled trials, the standard for establishing causality in medicine, are difficult to conduct under normal circumstances. They require patient enrollment, consent, randomization, data collection, follow-up, and statistical analysis at scales that take years to complete in ordinary settings. The recovery trial enrolled its first patient in March 2020 and had its dexamethasone result ready to announce in June 2020, approximately 100 days. This was possible because the trial was designed for rapid enrolment. The UK National Health Service infrastructure allowed efficient integration of the trial into routine hospital care, and the researchers made the decision to randomise patients to existing drugs rather than waiting for novel compounds to be developed and tested. The speed was a function of design choices made at the outset, choices that reflected a specific philosophy about how clinical research should respond to an emergency, and the speed was the difference between having an effective treatment in the first wave and not having one. The announcement of the dexamethasone result was covered with genuine enthusiasm in the medical and general press, and that coverage reflected something real. The relief of knowing that a simple, available, inexpensive intervention could meaningfully reduce death rates in the sickest patients at a moment when the armamentarium was otherwise limited. But the announcement also illustrated a pattern in pandemic communications that deserves attention. The gap between a treatment that reduces mortality by 1/3 in the sickest hospitalized patients and a treatment that cures COVID-19, prevents hospitalization, or works across the spectrum of disease severity is substantial, and it was not always communicated with the precision it deserved in the days following the announcement. Dexamethasone is a life-saving treatment for severe COVID-19 in hospitalized patients who require oxygen. It is not a prophylactic, not a treatment for mild disease, and not a substitute for vaccination, antiviral treatment, or the structural and social interventions that reduce transmission. The compound did exactly what it was tested to do. The work of communicating what that meant precisely and what it did not mean was the harder task that followed. It usually is. The dexamethasone result also prompted rapid global implementation. The WHO updated its treatment guidelines within days of the announcement, and the drug was integrated into COVID-19 treatment protocols across hospital systems worldwide with a speed that reflected both the clarity of the evidence and the simplicity of the intervention. No new supply chain needed to be established. No new regulatory approval was required. No new training was required for the nursing and medical staff who would administer it. The infrastructure was already there. The drug was already there. The knowledge of how to use it had just been updated. In the broader history of medicine, this is what it looks like when the existing pharmacological toolkit is applied systematically to a new problem, and the result is genuinely significant. The story of steroids does not end cleanly, because steroids have not stopped doing what they do: building muscle, reducing inflammation, managing the immune system, extending athletic careers, treating disease, enabling cheating, and generating regulatory debates that outlast every individual scandal they are attached to. New designer compounds continue to emerge. Anti-doping testing continues to improve, at a pace that periodically catches up and then falls behind again. Testosterone replacement therapy continues to expand its market. Corticosteroids continue to be the most prescribed class of anti-inflammatory drugs in the world. The compounds that began in a 1930s chemistry lab, in a Nobel Prize-winning collaboration that nobody at the time connected to the future of professional sport, bodybuilding culture, or the wellness industry, have become so thoroughly embedded in medicine, athletics, and everyday life that separating their legitimate uses from their contested ones has become one of the more genuinely complicated questions in modern pharmacology. Which is a long way of saying, this is not a story with a tidy ending. It is a story still in progress, running on multiple tracks simultaneously, generating new chapters faster than the old ones can be closed. The bodybuilding world of the 2020s bears almost no resemblance to the one John Ziegler was supplying in the 1960s, and the distance between them is not primarily about individual ambition or moral decline. It is about the accumulation of knowledge, compounds, and practices that each generation passed on to the next. The pharmacology of competitive bodybuilding at the professional level now involves combinations of anabolic steroids, growth hormone, insulin, diuretics, peptide hormones, and compounds that did not exist 30 years ago, stacked and cycled according to protocols developed empirically over decades within a community that has acquired genuine biochemical sophistication through necessity. The physiques produced by this pharmacology are unlike anything that existed before it, in both their extraordinary muscular development and, in some cases, in the expanded abdominal profile produced by growth hormone and insulin's effects on visceral organ size. A phenomenon called palumboism that has become an aesthetic debate within competitive bodybuilding and a health concern outside of it. Organs grow when exposed to sustained growth hormone and insulin signaling. The heart is an organ. The mortality data on professional bodybuilders who competed in the mass monster era of the 1990s and 2000s suggests that the pharmacological environment of elite competitive bodybuilding has cardiovascular consequences that are not subtle and not reversible. The online information ecosystem has transformed the culture of steroid use in ways that are simultaneously democratizing and alarming. Communities on dedicated forums, social media platforms, and video sharing sites have produced an enormous body of peer-generated information about steroid use, harm reduction guidance, dosing protocols, compound comparisons, cycle logs, and blood work interpretation that is in some respects more practically detailed and more current than what is available in the formal medical literature. The people writing this guidance are not physicians. They are experienced users sharing empirical knowledge accumulated through self-experimentation and observation of others, which produces information that is simultaneously valuable and unverified, specific and ungeneralizable, honest about what they have experienced and incapable of accounting for what they have not. Young men who encounter this ecosystem at 18 or 20 are receiving highly detailed guidance about how to use compounds that carry real long-term risks, delivered in a context that normalizes the use and minimizes the risks, from sources that have strong social incentives to present the activity favorably. The harm reduction framing is genuine, and the practical guidance is sometimes more useful than silence. The normalization is the problem. The anti-doping landscape continues to evolve in ways that reflect both the persistence of the problem and the genuine advances in detection capability. The stored sample retest program has produced ongoing waves of retroactive disqualification. Athletes from the 2008 Beijing Olympics and 2012 London Olympics lost medals when their archived samples were retested against detection methods that did not exist at the time of collection, years after the fact. This retroactive accountability has changed the risk calculation for doping in a meaningful way, though whether the change is sufficient to deter the practice at its most systematic levels remains debated. The Russian state doping scandal, documented in the McLaren report and its successors, demonstrated that when a state decides to systematically undermine the anti-doping system, substituting clean urine for contaminated urine through a hole in the laboratory wall, protecting athletes who would otherwise test positive, and lying to international bodies, the testing infrastructure has limited ability to prevent it in real time. The response, partial exclusions, participation under neutral flags, ongoing governance battles, has been widely viewed as inadequate to the scale of what was done, and the lessons about the limits of a voluntary compliance system have been absorbed slowly and incompletely by the institutions responsible for enforcing it. The pharmaceutical pipeline continues to produce new compounds with performance-enhancing potential, some of them emerging from legitimate medical research programs, and some of them engineered specifically for the enhancement market. Peptide hormones, growth factors, gene doping approaches that seek to modify the expression of performance-relevant genes. These represent the frontier of what the next decade's anti-doping challenge looks like. Gene doping, in particular, presents a detection problem that is categorically different from small molecule testing. Identifying the presence of a modified gene or an exogenous gene sequence in a biological sample requires approaches that are substantially more complex and expensive than urine testing for known compounds, and the regulatory and ethical frameworks for addressing it are still being developed in advance of the practice becoming widespread. That this seems futuristic is partly because it is, and partly because the history of doping suggests that by the time an approach seems futuristic, some laboratory somewhere is already testing it. What the history of steroids demonstrates, across all its contexts and controversies, is that the relationship between a powerful pharmacological compound and the society that encounters it is never simple, never static, and never fully controlled by the intentions of anyone involved. Not the chemists who synthesized it, not the physicians who prescribed it, not the athletes who used it, not the legislators who regulated it, and not the marketers who sold it. The compound has properties. Those properties intersect with human desires, institutional incentives, competitive pressures, and medical needs in ways that produce outcomes nobody specifically planned. The same molecule that helped a rheumatoid arthritis patient walk down the street in 1948 helped an East German swimmer win an Olympic gold medal she did not know she was cheating to win. The same compound that kept COVID-19 patients alive in 2020 built physiques that have produced chronic heart disease in men who are now in their 50s. The chemistry is neutral, what surrounds it is not. And the final, most honest thing to say about steroids, all of them, the ones in your bathroom cabinet and the ones in a professional athlete's blood and the ones your doctor prescribes and the ones synthesized in a laboratory to evade a test that hasn't been invented yet, is that they are a mirror held up to what humans want, what institutions allow, what markets sell, and what the body, given a chemical override of its own carefully calibrated limits, will do. The answer, in every case, is more, and then the consequences of more, and then the long, complicated work of living with both. So here you are, still breathing, horizontal hopefully, somewhere between awake and the comfortable dark at the edge of sleep, having just spent the last several hours inside one of the most complicated chemical stories in human history. Let's take a moment with what you've actually just travelled through. You started in a chemistry classroom, 4 carbon rings, nothing dramatic, nothing that announced itself as the beginning of anything. You move through the 1930s, when brilliant scientists extracted hormones from quantities of biological material that required more optimism than equipment, and won Nobel Prizes for synthesizing molecules that their grandchildren would watch get debated in congressional hearings. You pass through the quiet optimism of the 1940s, when testosterone was going to fix everything, when cortisone made a woman in a wheelchair stand up and walk, and when the gap between medicine and enhancement had not yet been drawn in any line anyone could see clearly. You watch that line get blurred in Helsinki in 1952 by a Soviet weightlifting team that showed up inexplicably enormous. You watched a small pink pill called Dianabol move from a pharmaceutical company's filing cabinet into the gym bags of athletes who were not asking whether it was a good idea, but only how much and how often. You watched the side effects arrive, as they always do, quietly, cumulatively, in the bodies of people who'd been told not to worry about them. You watched the scandals, the one in Seoul that most people remember, the ones in cycling that went on for decades before anyone said them out loud, the one in a Bay Area laboratory where a former musician was engineering molecules specifically designed to be invisible to science, for athletes whose names filled the sports pages and whose performances filled the stadiums, while everyone who might have asked inconvenient questions chose not to. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, in hospital wards and rheumatology clinics and burn units and oncology departments, physicians were using different members of the same chemical family to reduce inflammation in joints destroyed by autoimmune disease, to help children with growth hormone deficiency grow, to treat the wasting of HIV and cancer, and eventually, in a hospital room in 2020, to keep people breathing who would otherwise have stopped. The molecule does not know which of these stories it is part of. It never does. Chemistry is indifferent to context. It simply does what its structure determines it will do when it meets a receptor that recognizes it. The context, the ethics, the policy, the suffering, the achievement, the scandal, the healing, that part belongs to us. What you carry out of this, if you carry anything, is probably not a simple feeling. It is probably something more like the particular discomfort of a story that refuses to organize itself around heroes and villains, that insists on being both more useful and more harmful than you expected, that keeps producing consequences nobody intended from decisions that each seemed, in the moment, like reasonable responses to real problems. The physician who wanted to help soldiers recover faster, the coach who wanted his athletes to compete fairly on an unfair playing field, the researcher who saw a patient walk for the first time in years, the teenager in East Germany who swallowed a pill she was told was a vitamin, the man in his 40s who wanted simply to feel the way he remembered feeling when he was younger. None of these people are the same person. None of them made the same choice. All of them were part of the same 90-year story about what happens when powerful chemistry meets the full range of human motivation. And now that story has arrived at tonight. At you, in your bed, in a body that is, without your having done anything in particular to earn it, already running a sophisticated and largely successful steroid program of its own, cortisol managing your stress response, testosterone or estrogen maintaining your bones and your mood and your metabolism, a dozen other compounds doing their quiet, necessary work in the background of your being alive. You did not design the system. You did not approve it. You inherited it across an incomprehensibly long chain of ancestors who survived because the chemistry worked well enough, and most of the time it still does. So tonight, as you let the weight of your body settle into whatever surface is holding you, and as your breathing slows from the rhythm of listening to the rhythm of sleep, maybe carry this gently. The compounds are complicated. The 20 people who made them, used them, banned them, prescribed them, and abused them were complicated. The bodies they moved through were complicated, and yet through all of it, through the scandals and the Nobel Prizes, the congressional hearings and the hospital wards, the broken records and the broken health, the story is also, at its core, a story about human beings trying to be more than they are, stronger, less in pain, faster, longer lived, more themselves. That impulse is not always well directed, is not always honest about its costs, but it is recognizably, unmistakably human. And on that note, the most human note of all, it is time to let the chemistry do what it does best in the dark. Your cortisol is dropping, your melatonin is rising, your body, that remarkable and unsolicited gift, is doing exactly what it was built to do. Don't forget to subscribe and find us on Spotify. The link is in the description. But for now, sleep well.